That's fine.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hi, Kel.
Hi, Jeff.
So, for those in the audience who don't know as much about your background as they do about Slack, you and your co-founders came to Slack after building a video game called Glitch that hit some.
It didn't work out exactly. Yeah.
Didn't fully work out, but it did spawn. It did spawn the product idea that became Slack. Before that, you had done Flickr, which also sort of grew out as sort of spun out of another game that you had been building.
Another failed gaming project. Yeah.
So, tell me about what the connection is between video games and what you're doing now. Both of them have to do with building these sort of shared spaces, but what carries over?
Yeah, I think we definitely. So you gave a pretty good background of how we ended up where we are today. It was, we came together as a group to try and make a video game at a time when the internet was pretty different. So this was 2001, 2002, 2003. There were a lot fewer people on the internet. It was before any of the kind of giants that you know of today existed, or at least when they're in a very different form. You know, it's pre-social networks of any kind. It's pre-kind of the social interactive web in any kind of way. Pre-user-generated content on the web, aside from like small community stuff.
Internet 1.0.
Yeah, definitely. It's before the term Web 2.0 was coined. And at the time, we were trying to make this game that didn't work out, and Flickr was like a side project, like an idea on the side to try and make enough money to fund building the game that just became successful through a confluence of factors around like timing and where the internet was and where cameras were at the time. And I think the thread that definitely strongly connected the game and Flickr was that, I guess I need to explain a little bit about the game, which is something we never got good at, which is also why the games were never successful. But it wasn't like the games that you think of, like Call of Duty, shoot people, score the highest score, crush your opponents. It was very, very much more kind of harkening back to the space on the internet before, like social community spaces like Muds and Moos, like small community spaces for like playful exploration, the idea of play rather than gaming. And so we're trying to build this game in this kind of vague space that we thought would appeal to tons of people. It did not appeal to tons of people. But I think that what we were building was a space in which people could collaborate in small communities and find like shared interest groups and a space for people to come together on the internet, which was the promise of the internet at the time. Like it was going to be this great, breaking down the physical barriers that had been between, like if you lived in this village in Nebraska and you lived in Sweden, like you were never going to meet each other, even though you were like the only two people in the world who were really into some obscure character in Thundercats. I don't know. And the internet was like the promise of like small communities being able to form. And I think that's the thread that brought us through Flickr. So when we went back to try and make another game after that, the context of the game was very different. The internet had moved along a lot. We had Facebook. We had just about had the rise of the cell phone, the smartphone. People were using computers and using the internet in a very different way, but we were still trying to build a similar space. So we were looking at that kind of social space for kind of collaborative world building, kind of construction play. That also didn't work out and turned into Slack via an even like weirder route. Slack came to be, it was the productizing of the way we had worked together to build the game. And so it really wasn't like the game evolved into Slack in any way at all. Slack was a sharp right turn from building the game. But I think the thing which ties it all together is it's about like small communication spaces, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's like the DNA didn't make it into Slack, but the mitochondrial DNA did.
Yeah, maybe. Is that the right analogy? It's something like that.
Right
Definitely
analogy.
One of the biology bits made it through. And I think there's kind of like this, it's reflecting back to why I got excited about the internet in the first place in 2000. In the way I got into it was through blogging, which in 2000 was a very nascent. There were 20 people in the UK doing it, and it felt like we were building these small spaces for people to get together and communicate. And some of the concepts of those patterns are what has ended up coming through in Slack, the product, if that makes sense.
Like what kind of pattern?
So I think that one of the key things about the way Slack works is, if you think about kind of any software that you use for getting work done, there's like opinionated software and unopinionated software. So on the strongly opinionated side, you've got things like, if you do task tracking with Asana, you kind of have to agree to the Asana way of how you organize work and think about tasks. Like, it is strongly opinionated. If you use this software, you buy into the particular model that the Asana people say is the way that you should think about work. It's kind of, this is super well applies to task tracking, where you have the opinion, the philosophy of how you should work is tied to the software. As far as possible, we try to remove the opinion of how you should work together as a group from using Slack, so that different organizations are organized in different ways, people talk to each other in different ways, they use different tools, they have a different cadence. But the one thing which is kind of like baked into the software, which is our philosophy of how people should work together, is transparency and openness, kind of like an open by default. So if you think about, we see a lot of the people who come to Slack and find success with Slack were previously, Slack doesn't tend to replace another system like it that people were using. It tends to replace, that team uses Skype for messaging, and this team used to use AOL Instant Messenger, and this team is on WhatsApp, but really everyone has email as the shared substrate. And email is the lowest common denominator that everybody has. And the thing about email is it is one-to-one by default. So if it's like private by default. You can CC a bunch of people, you can have mailing lists, but really email is a one-to-one medium in the way it's built. And Slack with channels as kind of like the core construct is both broadcast by default and public for later, if that makes sense. So
broadcast by default and public for later.
Yeah, let me unpack that a little bit. So we encourage people to use channels as the primary mode of communication, which means that you're not just we might have a conversation in a channel, but other people in the channel see that conversation and take part in it. The other piece is, say we are the marketing department and we're discussing some marketing campaign. People in the sales group might not be in that channel, might not be seeing it, but they could dip in and see that content later. It's not hidden away, because it's not really a secret in our department. It's just it's not relevant to the day-to-day work of everybody else. So putting content into channels so that other people can either follow along with it in real time or look at it as necessary later, that kind of bringing transparency into the workplace by default is the thing that we kind of push as a philosophy.
Do you think, I don't know to what extent you think of Slack as existing in the same world as kind of social media, but in social media and consumer communications, you see this pendulum swinging back and forth between openness, public sharing and sort of private sharing. And right now we're, if you believe certain analysts, we're in a phase where people are gravitating more towards sort of private or ephemeral sharing, the kind that's not as transparent and open. Do you think that the same trends exist in business software?
I don't think it's I don't think the analogy holds up a lot, because when we talk about transparency and public information in the workplace, it's still very tightly scoped to the organization in which you work. And that's why coming from Flickr, which was very much a consumer product, to Slack, which is a product for work, we have some real advantages built in. So consumer products have to deal with all of the crazy shit that happens in the real world and all of the insane relationships between people. Now, those can happen on Slack too, but if they're happening in the workplace, that is not the problem of the software to solve, if that makes sense. So you have to worry about your crazy ex-partner stalking you on the public internet. If that happens in the company context, one of them is going to get fired. That's not something that the software has to defend against in the same way. So we're building a different set of tools which has kind of different built-in constraints. So the community of all of the people in the world is very different to the community of the workplace. That there are definitely some it's somewhat analogous, because not every workplace is a small company. You know, not every company is a team of people that you work with closely.
But you don't have to hire 10,000 people in the Philippines to read all the
to read all of the messages and check that none of them are abuse. No, it's very different in that way.
Right. And how about how does building games, building community in games compare to building community in or spaces for community in business software as a matter of like which one's harder?
Well, I mean, definitely survivorship bias here, but I'm going to say that games are harder. I think that games are kind of, building games is fundamentally different in at least one really important way. And that has been why we haven't, well, at least is partially the reason why we weren't successful at making games, other than we don't know how to make games, obviously. That is that we talk a lot in the kind of like consumer and business product side about the MVP, you know, minimum viable product. And for like a communication tool, the minimum viable product is being able to communicate with other people. And then there's a lot of like quality and experience that goes on top of that. The minimum viable product for a game is like the whole game. It's like if you take a video game and you take away all the sound, it's a terrible experience. Or if you like, you know, take away some, like you lo-fi the graphics, it's a very different experience. And so we were trying to build multiplayer online games. That required us to kind of deliver the whole thing and then see if it worked. Because it's like if you play like a few of the elements of a game, it doesn't. It's not fun. And fun isn't like you can measure it on a scale. You can't design for fun in the same way.
Yeah.
You know, the whole experience is part of the fun. And so we took 4 years to make the game Glitch before Slack. And like it took 3 years before we were like, well, the first thing we built over the last 3 years isn't actually fun. So now we have to go back and try and figure that out. So it's like finding product market fit is way more difficult, but all requires a lot more investment up front. And you see this with like the regular gaming industry where a game project will have been going on for years and then gets cancelled. And it's like there was no like game that came out early on and got iterated on in the same way.
So you spent 3.5 years trying to build a game that would be fun. You realized it wasn't fun. You had to do something else. And then in the course of a couple of months, you made Slack and released it out in the world, and everybody said, wow, this is fun.
Yeah, fun in a different way, I think. But yeah, I think the big advantage we had when we were building Slack was that Slack was really building a product out of the way we'd been communicating as a company already. So we'd spent the previous 4 years working together on this game. We had our engineering office in San Francisco. We had a game studio in Vancouver, in Canada. And we had, at peak, like 45, 50 people working on the game and all collaborating using a system that then became Slack. And so there's this like idea that when we were building the product, we did it for ourselves. We were building something to solve the immediate problem that we had of like get to the next step in building this game. So like the kind of idea of like egoless product design, we weren't trying to design a product, we weren't trying to design a product at all, we were just trying to get a solution in place that would solve our immediate needs. And so we iterated on that kind of unthinkingly for 4 years. At the end of the 4 years, when we shut the game down and we were trying to decide what we wanted to do next, we realized that whatever it was we did next, we would want to work together in the same way. So could we take that learning and turn it into a product? Now, like having yourself as your first primary customer is hugely advantageous in like you understand, or at least you believe you understand your customers' needs. You know, like you can try things really quick because they're with yourself. You can get really fast feedback. There are some definite disadvantages to that too. One is that kind of on the quality side, it's, I'm sure most people have experienced this. If you pick up somebody else's product of any kind, it's really easy to find all the faults and be critical. You're like, oh, that's stupid, that interaction's terrible, why did they do that? What were they fucking thinking? They had one job to make this thing good. And it's hard to have that same level of scrutiny over your own products, especially like when you've been working on something for a year, you know it really well, you know all the shortcuts, you're a power user, you're super forgiving of things that are janky because you're like, oh, I know that's broken, we're going to get to it later. And it's hard to bring like fresh eyes onto your own work.
Yeah.
And like imagine imagine you are a normal human, and like you had a shitty morning, and you argued with your partner, and you were late to work, and you've like fallen out with your boss, and you're late to this meeting, and somebody says, you have to use this software. Like, that is the mindset that a whole bunch of people seeing your product for the first time are going to be in. And that's not the same mindset of, I've been using it for 2 years, and I know we'll fix all those things.
So how do you get around that problem?
It's super difficult, and I think you just have to be aware of, like, remember how many people are going to view the things that you produce. You know, like, put yourself in that mindset of being super critical.
Well, one thing that Slack does, though, that I don't know if this addresses that problem, but there is this sense of, you know, fun and playfulness. I mean, sort of famously, you have these messages that greet you as soon as you sign in. I think the last one I saw said, remember to wear sunscreen, which is great. So that seems to also be part of the mitochondrial DNA that you brought with you from building games, right? You guys talk about play.
I think so, and I think that, like, you know, like, playfulness and the workplace are not in opposition to each other. It's not like there is play and there is work. And I think we've tried to infuse, like, playfulness as well as into the company, into the product in general. And I think that's a difficult fine line, because you don't want to be like too saccharine and too cloying. It's like you don't want to feel like you're like being spoken down to by the like business tools you use. So that would be ludicrous. But
mandatory
I think there's
fun.
Yeah, I think there's room for like having the you know, like right amount of mandated fun and playfulness in the workplace. I think, you know, that can manifest in a bunch of different ways. I personally am super obsessed with emoji, and that's the reason why we bought emoji into Slack initially. And it's like it is both a fun thing, but it is now being used as a tool to get work done. So we see people with emoji reactions in Slack building workflows out of those, using them as like approval processes, or like really like this way of having a hyper-dense communication. Like instead of like receiving 10 email replies from somebody saying, good job, yes, I agree, let's do this. It's just like you get 10 little thumbs up pictures under a message, and it's like a very dense way of communicating something that used to be horrible over email. You know, we've all been on those reply all email threads where you, like, the last 40 messages are people saying stop replying, and the ones before that was everybody agreeing, and it's like, email is a terrible medium for certain kinds of work, but we have just been stuck with it for a really long time. So I think we can marry those like really efficient bits of communication without being super serious about it.
Yeah. Have you ever had a product, has anybody ever suggested a product idea and you said, that's too fun, that's too playful?
I'm not sure that that's like the axis on which we've evaluated things, but probably. And I think it is a difficult fine line, you know, like we try and have playful copy, but there's times to be playful and there's times not to be playful. Like having super playful error messages, like when your software's broken, is like not a good area to go into.
That's true. Although the fail whale, you know, was like, that was something that people remember Twitter for.
I think it's celebrated now, but at the time people did not celebrate the fail whale.
That's a good point. I want to quickly, before we run out of time, I just want to ask about you know, this idea shared communication spaces on the web is something that, as you said, you know, when you started working in this area 15 years ago, it felt very utopian. In the last year or two, maybe not so much. Like social media in particular has taken a beating, feels very broken to a lot of people. Is there anything from your experience that gives you insight into how, you know, Facebook, Twitter, whatever else other platform you want to name can become fun again?
I don't have any like direct insight into that, and I think the comparison is difficult because if you look back 15, 20 years ago, the community space of people on the internet, it was, you know, like a community of all the people who use the internet, but there was like what's required for a community of interest, community of practice, is shared context or shared interest, shared understanding. And 20 years ago, that was the people who were really into the internet. It's like, yes, the web is going to be a big thing one day. So, you know, they had something in common, even if they were coming at it from very different angles. And, you know, the kind of the in-between time where we saw successful communities, they were all around areas of interest, areas of practice. If you just put together all of the people, it's not real, you know, you can call it you can say that Twitter is a community, but it's like a community of people, like with nothing particular in common other than access to the internet, which is just, you know, like, is America a community? Like, you look at like my neighborhood on Nextdoor, we're not a community. We are a bunch of insane people and then other people who watch them. There's like, you have to have a shared context and a shared understanding and a shared interest to form a community. And you can't do that with just all the people in the world. So, you know, the direction of those things becoming smaller, you know, is probably inevitable, but I don't really have any like useful advice or insight there.
I think you just did, actually. We're out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks.
Thank you. Standing ovation, huh? All right, man.